During the crisis, and this is sort of the Fed expanding its mission, the Fed took unprecedented actions, which you may or may not judge to have been prudent or necessary, but they certainly weren't consistent with the Fed's mission as previously understood. So the Fed wanted to sweeten the deal whereby J.P. Morgan Chase would acquire Bear-Stearns. Bear-Stearns was an investment house. They call it investment banks, but they're so different from commercial banks. Let's call it an investment house. They had previously never had taken any position on rescuing investment houses. Drexel Burnham Lambert failed in the 70s, and the Fed said, let the investment banking market sort that out, and they did, and there was no problem. But they decided they needed to rescue Bear-Stearns. That is, Bear-Stearns creditors shouldn't take any losses. That meant somebody had to assume those liabilities. Somebody had to buy Bear-Stearns. They got J.P. Morgan Chase to do it if the Fed would sweeten the deal. So the Fed bought $30 billion of the worst assets from the Bear-Stearns balance sheet. Now, there's no authority in the Federal Reserve Act for the Fed to do that. The Federal Reserve Act says the Fed can lend to an ongoing institution, but not absorb bad assets this way. That traditionally has been the role of the FDIC, but this was not an insured institution. It's an investment house. So what did the Fed do? They created a subsidiary of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York called Maiden Lane, LLC. That's one of the streets that runs along the side of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the Fed lent money to Maiden Lane, and Maiden Lane then bought the assets from Bear-Stearns. So you see, the Fed did not buy the assets. That's kind of skirting the law. They did the same thing with AIG. They created Maiden Lane 2 and Maiden Lane 3. Oh, it says 2 and 2. No, that second one should be a 3. They created special lending facilities. Well, this, you might say, is more in line with the lender of last resort role, except that they had lending facilities not just for commercial banks, but for investment banks, for brokerage houses, for money market mutual funds, all kinds of financial institutions that didn't used to have access to the Fed's lending. That has to be worrying because it's going to change the incentives of those institutions to behave prudently going forward. And this we only found out when Bloomberg.com forced the Fed to reveal it through a Freedom of Information Act suit. The Fed had special lines of credit set up for Citibank and Bank of America because it knew they were insolvent. I think it's legal for me to say that. They didn't actually use them, but the Fed was standing by ready to inject as much as necessary to keep them afloat. And then we had the QE 1, 2, and 3. So if you think that policy ought to be predetermined by stipulated rules, right? Classical idea is the rule of law. People should be able to predict what government agencies are going to do. Then you have to be disturbed by the Fed sort of making it up as it goes along. It's also not consistent with the lender of last resort role. Now, there's a certain amount of discretion built into being a lender of last resort. You have to decide which institutions are solvent and therefore worth saving, which are insolvent and therefore ought to be closed. But the Fed wasn't trying to make that discrimination here. It was bailing out institutions that everybody knew was insolvent. Now, they didn't rescue Lehman. They didn't rescue Lehman because Lehman was so insolvent they couldn't get anybody to buy it at any price.